Yes. The word came out as a whisper. Yes, we were planning to. To make it look like you died from stress. From grief. How? My voice rose. How were you going to do it? What was the plan, Richard? Pills in my coffee? Something injected while I slept? How does a husband murder the woman he promised to love forever? Insulin, he said, tears streaming down his face. Marcus Webb said a large dose of insulin would cause hypoglycemic shock that would look like cardiac arrest in someone your age, especially someone under emotional stress. It's nearly undetectable unless they specifically test for it, which they wouldn't in a 77-year-old woman who just lost her son. I felt nothing. No shock, no pain, just a vast cold emptiness. I'd moved beyond hurt into some realm where human emotions couldn't follow. You sat across from me at breakfast for 7 weeks, I said. You saw me crying. You watched me lose weight. You heard me screaming in my sleep. And you were just waiting for the right moment to kill me too. I wasn't going to go through with it. Richard suddenly shouted into the phone. After Michael died, after I saw what we'd done, I told Vanessa I couldn't do it again. I couldn't kill you. I was done. Liar. I'm not lying. 2 days before the funeral, I told Vanessa we needed to turn ourselves in, that I couldn't live with what we'd done, that I couldn't kill you too. And she said if I backed out, she'd make sure I went to prison for everything: the affair, the financial fraud, Michael's murder, while she walked away claiming I'd manipulated her. So you were going to let her kill me instead? Richard's face went white. What? No. I wouldn't. The police found more text messages, Richard. From after Michael's death. Vanessa asked you if you still wanted to proceed with Phase 2 and you responded, give me a few more weeks. Phase 2. That was me. You were still planning it even after you saw what murdering your son did to me. I was trying to stall. I was trying to figure out how to. Stop lying, I screamed into the phone, not caring who heard me. Stop lying and just admit what you are. You're a monster who was going to murder his entire family for money. Your son, your wife. Who else, Richard? Were you going to kill Patricia too? My friends? Anyone who might inherit anything when I died? I'm sorry, he sobbed. God, Diane, I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened to me. I don't know how I became this person. I lie awake every night trying to understand it myself. I'll tell you what happened, I said coldly. You got old and scared and selfish. You couldn't accept that life moves forward, that you weren't special or important anymore. So when a pretty young woman paid attention to you, you threw away everything: your integrity, your family, your humanity, for the ego boost of being desired again. And when that wasn't enough, when reality threatened to intrude, you chose murder, twice. I stood up, preparing to leave. But I had one more thing to say. Michael's trial starts in 6 weeks. I'm going to be there every single day. I'm going to watch you get convicted. And then I'm going to attend Vanessa's trial and watch her get convicted too. And I'm going to live, Richard. I'm going to live a long, full life. I'm going to travel and make new friends and find joy again eventually. And every single day that I'm alive and happy will be another day you're rotting in prison, knowing you failed. You didn't get the money. You didn't get Vanessa. You didn't get me. You got nothing except life in prison and the knowledge that you murdered your son for absolutely nothing. I hung up the phone and walked out, leaving Richard sobbing behind the plexiglass. In the parking lot, Patricia hugged me tightly. You're the strongest person I've ever known. I'm not strong, I said. I'm just too angry to die yet. And that's going to have to be enough. That night, alone in my house, I took every photo of Richard off the walls. 32 years of marriage memories, wedding photos, vacation pictures, anniversary celebrations all went into boxes destined for the trash. I erased him from my home the same way he'd tried to erase me from existence. Tomorrow, I would call a divorce lawyer. I would start proceedings to ensure Richard got nothing when I died. Not my house, not my savings, nothing. Everything would go to Patricia and to charities in Michael's name. Richard had wanted me dead to steal my money. Instead, I would outlive him and make sure every penny I had went to preventing what happened to Michael from happening to other families. It wasn't justice, but it was something, and something was all I had to hold on to. January arrived with rain and cold that seeped into my bones. Richard's trial was scheduled to begin on January 15th, exactly 3 months after Michael's murder. 3 months that felt like 3 lifetimes. Ada Rebecca Chen had been preparing me for weeks, coaching me on testimony, warning me about what Richard's defense attorney would try to do during cross-examination. "They're going to paint you as bitter," she explained during one of our sessions at the prosecutor's office. "They'll suggest you're so consumed by hatred that you're not a reliable witness. They'll try to make the jury feel sorry for Richard, a man who made terrible mistakes but doesn't deserve life in prison. He murdered our son and planned to murder me," I said flatly. "How do they defend that?" "They'll argue diminished capacity, temporary insanity brought on by what they'll call a late-life crisis. They'll bring in psychiatrists who'll testify that Richard was suffering from depression after retirement, that he wasn't in his right mind, that Vanessa manipulated him into actions he never would have taken otherwise. That's absurd. It's a strategy, and sometimes it works." Rebecca pulled out a thick binder. "That's why we need to be absolutely prepared. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every text message and financial record. We're going to bury him in his own choices." Over the next 2 weeks, I met with the prosecution team daily. I reviewed evidence until I could recite it from memory. I practiced staying calm under hostile questioning. I learned to breathe through panic attacks when they showed me photos from the crash site. But nothing prepared me for what happened on January 8th, 1 week before the trial. I was at home sorting through more of Michael's belongings, a task I did in small increments because it was too painful to do all at once when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a young woman I didn't recognize. She was petite, blonde, probably in her late 20s, and she was crying. Against my better judgment, I opened the door with the chain still attached. "Can I help you?" "Mrs. Foster?" Her voice was soft, trembling. "My name is Alicia Morrison. I worked with Michael at Amazon. I need to talk to you about something I should have told the police months ago." I let her in, my heart racing. She sat on my couch, twisting a tissue in her hands, clearly terrified. "What do you need to tell me?" "I was in love with Michael," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Not that he knew. I never said anything because he was married and I respected that. But Mrs. Foster, I saw things at work that I didn't report because I thought I was imagining them, or because I didn't want to seem like a jealous coworker, and now I hate myself. Because maybe if I'd said something, Michael would still be alive." My chest tightened. "What did you see?" Vanessa came to the office several times in the months before Michael died. She'd meet him for lunch or bring him coffee. Everyone thought she was just a devoted wife. But twice I saw her talking to this older man in the parking garage. They were standing very close, touching each other in a way that wasn't appropriate. And one time, I heard her say, "After it's done," and he said, "We'll be free." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Did you recognize the man?" "No, not then." "But after Michael died and the news showed your husband's photo," she pulled out her phone and showed me a picture she'd clearly taken from a distance. "This is from September 20th. That's Vanessa. And that man. It was Richard. In the Amazon parking garage, his hand on Vanessa's waist, her looking up at him with an expression of complete intimacy. September 20th was 3 weeks after they started planning to kill Michael," I said numbly. "They were meeting at his workplace, bold enough to meet where he worked, where anyone could see them." "There's more," Alicia said. "The day before Michael died, October 19th, I stayed late at the office working on a deadline. Around 8 p.m., I went to the break room, and I overheard Michael on his phone in the conference room. The door was open a crack. He was saying, 'I know everything. I've known for weeks. I hired someone to follow you, and I have photos. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to tell my mother, and then I'm going to the police. You and him, you're both going to pay for what you've done to her.' I pressed my hand to my mouth, tears burning my eyes. Michael's last night alive. He'd been at work, planning to expose them the next morning, and they'd known. They'd killed him before he could tell me. Did you tell the police this?" I told them about overhearing the phone call, but I didn't tell them about the parking garage encounters because I was scared. Vanessa's lawyer contacted me 2 weeks ago. He offered me money, $50,000, to testify that Michael seemed unstable at work, that he was paranoid and accused multiple people of affairs that didn't exist. He wanted me to make Michael look crazy. "Did you take the money?" "No. God, no. But Mrs. Foster, that's when I realized how evil these people are. They murdered Michael, and now they're trying to destroy his reputation to save themselves. I came here because I need to tell the truth. I need to testify about what I saw and heard. Michael deserves that. I called Detective Morrison immediately. Within an hour, Alicia was at the police station giving a full statement. Her testimony would be crucial, an unbiased witness who could confirm Richard and Vanessa's relationship and Michael's knowledge of it before he died. But the attempted bribery was even more significant. It showed consciousness of guilt, an attempt to manipulate evidence. Ada Chen was ecstatic. "This is exactly what we need," she said. "Defense attorneys trying to bribe witnesses to lie? That's going to destroy their credibility with the jury." 2 days later, another visitor appeared at my door. This time it was a man in his 50s, well-dressed, carrying a briefcase. He introduced himself as David Brennan, Vanessa's defense attorney. "Mrs. Foster, I know this is highly irregular, but I need 5 minutes of your time. I have nothing to say to you. Please, just 5 minutes. It's about Vanessa's baby." The word baby stopped me. I'd been trying not to think about the fact that Vanessa was pregnant with Richard's child, that somewhere in jail she was carrying my grandchild, the half-sibling of my murdered son. Reluctantly, I let him stand in my doorway. I didn't invite him in. "Mrs. Foster, Vanessa's pregnancy is high risk. The stress of incarceration, the poor nutrition, the lack of proper prenatal care, it's endangering the baby. My client is willing to make a deal. She'll plead guilty to manslaughter instead of first-degree murder in exchange for being released to house arrest during her pregnancy. After the baby is born, she'll surrender to serve her sentence. If this moment truly hit home for you, don't forget to tap that like button. It tells me you're right here with me. Can you see a bit of yourself in this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what part spoke to you most." "Absolutely not. Mrs. Foster, we're talking about an innocent child. We're talking about a murderer who wants to manipulate the system by using her pregnancy," I said coldly. "Vanessa got pregnant deliberately to trap Richard into leaving his family. She was already pregnant when she helped drug my son and watched him die. That baby was conceived in the middle of planning a murder. I have no sympathy." "The baby is your grandchild," Brennan pressed. "Your husband's child. Don't you want to ensure it's born healthy?" "That baby is not my grandchild. My grandchildren would have come from Michael, the son your client murdered. That baby is the product of an affair that led to my family's destruction. And I will fight any attempt to give Vanessa special treatment because she decided to get pregnant with her married lover while plotting to kill his son." Brennan's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Foster. Juries are sympathetic to pregnant women. When they see Vanessa on the stand, 7 months pregnant with a man's baby after he forced her to help him commit murder. "Get off my property," I said, "before I call the police and report you for witness intimidation." He left, but his words haunted me. He was right about one thing: juries might be sympathetic to a pregnant young woman, especially one claiming abuse and coercion. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that baby. A child who would be born in prison or shortly after. A child who would grow up knowing their father was a murderer, their mother was a murderer, that they existed because of an affair that destroyed a family. At 2 in the morning, I called Patricia. "I don't know if I can do this," I told her, my voice breaking. "I don't know if I can sit in that courtroom and watch them manipulate the jury with lies about being in love and being scared. I don't know if I can hear them try to make Michael's murder sound like anything other than what it was: cold-blooded, calculated evil." "You can do it," Patricia said firmly. "Because Michael needs you to. Because if you don't show up and tell the truth, they might get away with lighter sentences. They might eventually get out of prison and live their lives while Michael stays dead forever." She was right. I had no choice but to be strong enough to face this trial. On January 13th, 2 days before the trial began, I visited Michael's grave. I'd been there dozens of times in the past 3 months, but this visit felt different. Final, somehow. I knelt on the cold ground and placed my hand on his headstone. The inscription read, "Michael Robert Foster, beloved son, 1991 to 2025, forever in our hearts." "The trial starts in 2 days, baby," I said aloud, not caring if anyone heard me. "I'm going to tell them everything. I'm going to make sure the jury knows exactly what you meant to me, what they took from the world when they killed you. I'm going to make sure they never forget your name." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of rain and earth. For just a moment, I felt something: a warmth, a presence, a sense that Michael was somehow there with me. "I love you," I whispered. "I will always love you, and I will get justice for you, I promise." When I stood to leave, I noticed someone watching me from across the cemetery, a woman in a dark coat and sunglasses. She was too far away for me to see clearly, but something about her posture seemed familiar. As I walked toward my car, she turned and disappeared behind a mausoleum. I had the unsettling feeling I'd just been watched by someone connected to this nightmare, but I couldn't prove it, couldn't do anything about it. 2 more days. Then the trial would begin. Then the world would hear everything. And Richard and Vanessa would finally face consequences for destroying my family. January 15th arrived gray and bitter, the kind of Seattle morning where the cold seeps through every layer of clothing and settles in your bones. I stood outside the King County Courthouse at 7:30 a.m., 2 hours before the trial was scheduled to begin, watching news vans set up their equipment and reporters rehearse their opening segments. Patricia held my arm, steadying me. Eleanor stood on my other side. Jessica and 3 other women from my book club formed a protective circle around me. They'd all taken the day off work to be here, to sit in that courtroom as my support system. "You ready for this?" Patricia asked quietly. "No. But I'm here anyway." Inside, we went through security metal detectors, bag searches, the works. The courthouse was already packed with people hoping to get seats in the gallery. The bailiff recognized me and escorted our group to the reserved section for family members. Family. What a cruel word now. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined from watching legal dramas on television. Dark wood paneling, fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly sickly, uncomfortable benches for spectators. The jury box sat empty, waiting for the 12 people who would decide Richard's fate. At 8:45, the prosecution team arrived. Ada Rebecca Chen looked professional and fierce in a navy suit, her hair pulled back severely, her expression focused. She stopped by my seat. "How are you holding up, Diane?" "I'm here. That's all I can manage." "That's enough. Remember, you don't testify until day 3, probably. Today is opening statements and beginning of evidence presentation. You'll hear things that will hurt. You'll hear Richard's attorney try to make him sympathetic. Just breathe through it. We've got this." At 8:58, a door opened and Richard was led in wearing a dark suit I recognized one. I'd bought him for our 30th anniversary 3 years ago. The irony was sickening. His hands were cuffed but would be freed once he sat at the defense table. He looked thin and gray, older than his 66 years. When his eyes swept the courtroom and found mine, I stared back with no expression. No tears, no anger, nothing. I wanted him to see that he no longer had power over my emotions. I was here as a witness to justice, not as his grieving wife. He looked away first. His attorney, Malcolm Hendricks, was everything I expected: expensive suit, perfect hair, the kind of man who'd made millions defending people everyone knew were guilty. He patted Richard's shoulder in what was clearly a calculated gesture of support for the jury to see. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff called, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Catherine Miller." Judge Miller entered, the same judge who'd presided over the preliminary hearings. She was in her mid-60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd seen every kind of criminal case in her 30 years on the bench. She would not be easily fooled. "Please be seated. We are here today in the matter of the State of Washington versus Richard Thomas Foster, case number 2025 CR 8847. Will counsel please introduce themselves for the record?" Ada Chen stood. "Rebecca Chen for the State of Washington, Your Honor." Malcolm Hendricks rose smoothly. "Malcolm Hendricks and Associate Counsel Jennifer Wu for the defendant, Your Honor." "Very well. Are we ready to proceed with jury selection?" The next 4 hours were excruciating. Potential jurors were called in groups of 12. Each was questioned about their knowledge of the case, their ability to be impartial, their views on circumstantial evidence and family relationships. The defense team struck anyone who admitted following the news coverage extensively. The prosecution struck anyone who expressed sympathy for older people going through life crises. By early afternoon, they'd seated 12 jurors and 4 alternates, 7 women, 5 men, ranging in age from 26 to 68. Judge Miller addressed them. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you are about to hear a case involving serious charges: first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. You must base your verdict solely on the evidence presented in this courtroom, not on media coverage, not on emotion, but on facts and testimony. Do you understand?" They all nodded or murmured agreement. "Very well. We'll take a 30-minute recess, then proceed with opening statements. During the break, I couldn't eat the sandwich Patricia tried to give me. I went to the bathroom and stared at my reflection, a 77-year-old woman who looked 90, hollowed out by grief and betrayal. But my eyes were hard, determined. I was still standing. That counted for something. At 2 p.m., Judge Miller reconvened court. "Miss Chen, your opening statement, please." Rebecca Chen stood and approached the jury box. She made eye contact with each juror before beginning to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about greed. Pure, calculated greed." On October 20th of last year, Michael Foster, a 28-year-old software engineer, a son, a husband, died in what appeared to be a tragic drunk driving accident on Interstate 5. But it wasn't an accident. She paused, letting that sink in. Michael Foster was murdered by his own father, Richard Foster, and his wife, Vanessa Chen Foster, because Michael had discovered their 11-month affair and was going to expose them. More importantly, Michael was about to expose financial fraud, the theft of $193,000 from family accounts. He was going to divorce Vanessa, leaving her with nothing. He was going to report Richard to the authorities for embezzlement, so they killed him. Rebecca walked to a large display board and pulled back a covering, revealing a timeline. This is the timeline of a murder. August. Richard pays Marcus Webb, a former medic, $78,000 for information on how to kill someone and make it look natural. September. Richard and Vanessa begin detailed planning through text messages and secret meetings. October 19th. Michael confronts them, tells them he knows everything, says he's going to the police the next morning. That night, she pointed to October 20th on the timeline. Richard and Vanessa meet Michael for dinner, crush 8 Ambien pills into his drink, wait for the medication to take effect, then send him driving onto Interstate 5 while severely impaired. Vanessa gets out of the car before the crash. Richard follows in his own vehicle. Together, they watch Michael die. Several jurors looked shocked. One older woman put her hand to her mouth. "The evidence in this case is overwhelming," Rebecca continued. "Text messages where they planned the murder. Financial records showing the defendant withdrew nearly $200,000 to fund an affair and pay for murder planning. Video recordings Michael made showing the defendant and Vanessa together in Michael's own home. A letter the defendant wrote to his wife confessing to everything. And testimony from Marcus Webb about being hired to help plan not just Michael's murder, but also the murder of Michael's mother, Diane Foster, who sits in this courtroom today. Every juror's eyes found me. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, refusing to cry. "This is not a crime of passion," Rebecca said, her voice rising. "This is not a tragic mistake. This is cold-blooded, premeditated murder for financial gain. At the end of this trial, when you've heard all the evidence, I will ask you to return a verdict of guilty on all counts. Thank you." She sat down. Judge Miller turned to the defense table. "Mr. Hendricks?" Malcolm Hendricks stood slowly, deliberately. He had an avuncular quality, like everyone's favorite uncle who tells great stories at Thanksgiving. He walked toward the jury with his hands in his pockets, casual, approachable. "Folks, I'm not going to stand here and tell you Richard Foster didn't make terrible mistakes. He did. He had an affair with his daughter-in-law. That's horrible. It's a betrayal of his son and his wife and everything a family should be. But making terrible mistakes doesn't make someone a murderer." He paused, making eye contact with several jurors. "What the prosecution isn't going to tell you is that Richard Foster is a 66-year-old man who spent 2 years in retirement feeling purposeless, invisible, like his life was over. Then a younger woman paid attention to him, and he made the worst decision of his life. He pursued a relationship with her. Was it wrong? Absolutely. Was it cruel? Yes. But it wasn't murder." He walked to his own display board. "The evidence will show that Vanessa Chen is a master manipulator. She pursued Richard. She seduced him. She told him Michael was abusive, that she was trapped, that she needed Richard to save her. And when Richard tried to end the affair, which he did multiple times, as text messages will show, Vanessa threatened him. She threatened to tell everyone. She threatened to claim he'd forced himself on her. She controlled him through fear and manipulation. I wanted to scream. This was the strategy: make Richard the victim, make Vanessa the villain. Shift all blame onto the woman, while the man who actually murdered his own son gets sympathy. On the night Michael died," Hendricks continued, Richard Foster did not intend for anyone to die. Yes, he put medication in Michael's drink, but only because Vanessa told him it would make Michael sleepy and confused, make him easier to discredit if he tried to tell people about the affair. Richard didn't know Vanessa was planning to let Michael drive. He didn't know she was planning to get out of the car. He followed them because Vanessa told him to, but he didn't understand what was really happening until it was too late. "That's a lie!" The words burst from my mouth before I could stop them. Judge Miller's gavel came down hard. "Mrs. Foster, you will remain silent or you will be removed from this courtroom." "I apologize, Your Honor," I said, my voice shaking. Patricia grabbed my hand, squeezing hard. Hendricks looked at me with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "I understand Mrs. Foster's pain. No mother should have to endure what she's endured. But pain doesn't change facts. And the fact is that Richard Foster was manipulated by a younger, calculating woman into actions he never would have taken on his own." He turned back to the jury. "At the end of this trial, when you've heard all the evidence, including Richard's own testimony about how Vanessa manipulated him, I'm going to ask you to consider whether Richard Foster is a cold-blooded killer or a foolish old man who made terrible choices while under the influence of a master manipulator. Thank you." As he sat down, I saw two jurors nodding slightly. He'd gotten to them already. The narrative of the older man seduced and controlled by the younger woman, it was classic, and it worked because society wanted to believe it. Judge Miller looked at the clock. "It's 3:15. We'll adjourn for today and begin with the prosecution's first witness tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Jury, remember, do not discuss this case with anyone. Do not read news coverage. Do not conduct your own research. Court is adjourned." As everyone stood and the jury filed out, I remained seated, my body feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Day 1 was over, weeks more to go. "You okay?" Patricia asked. "No, but I will be, because I'm going to sit here every single day and watch them try to lie their way out of what they did. And I'm going to be here when the jury says guilty." That night, alone in my house, I replayed Hendricks's words. "Foolish old man, master manipulator." The strategy was clear: sacrifice Vanessa, save Richard. But I knew something they didn't. I had Richard's confession letter. I had his own words admitting to planning both murders. And when I testified, I was going to make sure that jury knew exactly who Richard Foster really was. Not a foolish old man, a monster who murdered his own child for money. Day 2 of the trial began with the prosecution's first witness, Detective Sarah Morrison. She took the stand wearing a crisp, dark suit, her badge visible on her belt, her expression professional and composed. ADA Rebecca Chen guided her through her credentials: 15 years with Seattle PD, 8 in homicide, dozens of murder investigations. Then they moved to the night of October 20th. "Detective Morrison, can you describe the scene when you arrived at the crash site?" "I arrived at approximately 12:40 a.m. on October 21st. The vehicle, a Tesla Model 3, had struck a concrete barrier on the southbound side of Interstate 5 at high speed. The driver, Michael Foster, was pronounced dead at the scene. The passenger, Vanessa Chen Foster, had already been transported to Harborview Medical Center with reported minor injuries." "What were your initial impressions?" "The damage pattern was unusual. The driver's side was catastrophically damaged, consistent with a 70-mile-per-hour impact. But the passenger side, where Mrs. Chen claimed to have been sitting, showed minimal intrusion. The passenger airbag had deployed, but there was very little blood or tissue on it, which would be expected in a violent collision." Rebecca displayed crime scene photos on screens throughout the courtroom. Several jurors grimaced at the images of Michael's destroyed vehicle. I forced myself to look, to bear witness to what they'd done to my son. "What did the toxicology report reveal?" "Michael Foster had a blood alcohol content of 0.15 and high levels of Ambien, a prescription sleep medication, in his system. The combination would have severely impaired his ability to drive safely." "Did Michael Foster have a prescription for Ambien?" "No. But his father, the defendant Richard Foster, had an active prescription. We later determined that Richard's prescription bottle, which should have contained 30 pills based on the refill date, was completely empty." "What did that tell you?" "That someone had used Richard Foster's Ambien for purposes other than his own sleep disorder." Malcolm Hendricks stood. "Objection. Speculation. Sustained. The jury will disregard the witness's conclusion." But the damage was done. The jury had heard it. Rebecca continued. Detective Morrison, when did this case change from a traffic accident investigation to a murder investigation? On October 25th, 5 days after Michael's death, when Mrs. Diane Foster contacted me with evidence she'd discovered suggesting her husband and daughter-in-law were having an affair and had planned Michael's death. What evidence did Mrs. Foster provide? Text messages between Richard Foster and Vanessa Chen discussing the affair and making references to solving the Michael problem. Financial records showing Richard had withdrawn $193,000 over 11 months. Browser history on Richard's computer showing searches for hotels, jewelry, divorce lawyers, and most significantly searches about Ambien dosages and effects when combined with alcohol. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Miller gaveled for silence. Rebecca entered the evidence into the record, dozens of exhibits showing the text exchanges, the bank statements, the search histories. Each one was displayed on the courtroom screens. The jury leaned forward, reading intently. One text message particularly drew gasps. Vanessa to Richard, September 28th. How much longer do we have to wait? I'm tired of pretending to love him. Richard to Vanessa, September 28th. Soon. We need to be patient. Once he's gone, everything gets easier. 2.4 million easier. Detective Morrison, did you interview Richard Foster after his arrest? Yes, on October 26th. He initially denied everything, then eventually confessed to having an affair but claimed the death was accidental. However, when confronted with the evidence, particularly the text messages and financial records, he requested his attorney and stopped cooperating. Malcolm Hendricks's cross-examination was aggressive. Detective Morrison, did you ever consider that my client might have been telling the truth? That this was an affair that went wrong, not premeditated murder? The evidence doesn't support that conclusion. But you're not a mind reader, are you? You can't know what was in Richard Foster's heart that night. I don't need to read minds when I have text messages explicitly discussing murder plans. Those texts could be interpreted multiple ways, couldn't they? Everything gets easier. Could mean easier to divorce, easier to be together publicly. It could, except it's followed by 2.4 million easier, which is the exact amount of life insurance and assets Michael Foster represented. That's not about divorce. That's about death benefits. Several jurors nodded. Hendricks had walked into that trap, and Detective Morrison had sprung it perfectly. The next witness was Marcus Webb. The former medic Richard had paid $78,000. Webb looked uncomfortable in his suit, his hands fidgeting as he was sworn in. Rebecca established his background, then cut to the heart of his testimony. Mr. Webb, did Richard Foster hire you in August of last year? Yes, ma'am. What did he hire you to do? He said he needed information about medications that could cause heart failure in elderly people without being easily detected. Did he say why he needed this information? He told me his mother-in-law was elderly and suffering, wanted to end her life peacefully but didn't want her family to know she'd chosen that path. He made it sound compassionate, like he was helping someone who was ready to go. But that wasn't true, was it? No, ma'am. After Mr. Foster was arrested, police told me the elderly mother-in-law he was asking about was his wife, Mrs. Diane Foster. Webb looked at me, shame evident on his face. I'm real sorry, ma'am. I didn't know. If I'd known he was planning to murder someone who didn't want to die, I never would have. Objection, Hendricks called. The witness is speculating about intent. Sustained. Mr. Webb, please stick to what you know factually. Yes, Your Honor. What I know factually is that Richard Foster paid me $78,000 for detailed information on how to cause cardiac arrest using insulin injections, how much to use, where to inject it, and how to make it look like natural causes in someone under stress. The courtroom was dead silent. Did Mr. Foster ever mention his son Michael? Yes. After I gave him the information about the insulin method, he asked if the same technique could be used on a younger, healthier person. I said it could, but it would be riskier because a young person's autopsy would be more thorough. That's when he asked about using Ambien combined with alcohol to create an accident scenario. My hands gripped the bench in front of me so hard my knuckles went white. Richard had asked about killing Michael before they actually did it. This was even more premeditated than I'd realized. Did you provide that information? No, ma'am. I told him Ambien and alcohol was dangerous information and I wasn't comfortable discussing it. He said he understood and left. I thought that was the end of it. Webb's voice dropped. Then I saw the news about Michael Foster dying in a crash with Ambien and alcohol in his system, and I knew what I'd helped enable by giving Richard that information about the insulin. Why didn't you come forward immediately? Because I was scared. And because Richard had paid me cash, no paper trail, I thought maybe I could just disappear, move somewhere else, pretend it never happened. But I couldn't live with myself. So when the police found me, I told them everything. Hendrix's cross-examination tried to paint Webb as an unreliable criminal trying to reduce his own sentence by lying about Richard, but Webb held firm. "I'm not lying, sir. I wish I was. I wish I'd never taken that money. I wish I'd gone to the police the minute Richard Foster asked me about ways to kill people. But I didn't. And Michael Foster died because of it. That's something I'll carry for the rest of my life." The third key witness of the day was Dr. Patricia Simmons, the medical examiner who'd performed Michael's autopsy. "Dr. Simmons, what did your examination of Michael Foster reveal?" "Massive trauma from the vehicle collision. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, injuries consistent with high-speed impact. However, the toxicology findings were what raised questions." "What questions?" "The level of Ambien in his system was extremely high consistent, with 8 to 10 pills crushed and dissolved. Combined with the alcohol, Michael Foster would have been severely impaired, slurred speech, poor coordination, possibly experiencing hallucinations or confusion. He should not have been driving. In your professional opinion, could Michael Foster have accidentally taken that much Ambien?" "No. The amount found in his system indicates deliberate administration by someone else. You can't accidentally ingest 8 pills. Could this death have been anything other than homicide?" "Objection." Hendrix was on his feet. "The medical examiner's job is to determine cause of death, not classify it as homicide." Judge Miller considered. "I'll allow it. The witness may answer based on her expertise." Dr. Simmons looked directly at the jury. Given the level of medication, the circumstances, and the investigation findings, this was homicide. Someone drugged Michael Foster with the intention of impairing his ability to drive safely. Whether they intended for him to crash specifically or just to be incapacitated, the result was his death. That makes it homicide. The prosecution rested for the day at 4 p.m. Judge Miller dismissed the jury with her standard instructions about not discussing the case. As we left the courthouse, reporters surrounded us. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved in my face. "Mrs. Foster, how do you feel about today's testimony? Do you think the jury believes your husband is guilty? What do you want to say to Richard Foster?" Patricia and Eleanor formed a protective barrier, pushing through the crowd to get me to Patricia's car. Once inside, away from the cameras and questions, I finally let myself breathe. "That was brutal," Eleanor said from the back seat. "But good for our side," Patricia added. "That medical examiner was devastating. And Marcus Webb, even the defense, couldn't shake his testimony." I stared out the window at Seattle passing by. Somewhere in this city, Vanessa sat in her cell, probably strategizing with her lawyer about how to blame everything on Richard. And Richard sat in his cell, probably still believing somehow he could convince a jury he was just a foolish old man who'd been manipulated. But the evidence didn't lie, the text didn't lie, Michael's body didn't lie. Tomorrow, the prosecution would call more witnesses. Financial experts to detail the stolen money, Amazon colleagues to testify about Michael's state of mind before he died. And eventually in a few days they'd call me. I would have to sit on that witness stand and tell 12 strangers about my son, my marriage, my complete and total destruction at the hands of people I'd loved and trusted. But I would do it. Because Michael deserved nothing less than the full, horrible truth told in a court of law where it would become permanent record. If this scene touched your heart, tap like to let me know it resonated with you. Do you see a glimpse of your own story in theirs? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Where it could never be erased or forgotten. Where justice finally, painfully, inadequately might be served. Day 5 of the trial arrived on a Wednesday morning that felt apocalyptic. I'd barely slept the night before, rehearsing my testimony in my head, knowing that today I would have to relive the worst moments of my life in front of strangers, cameras, and the man who'd destroyed everything. ADA Rebecca Chen met me in a private room before court convened. "Remember what we practiced. Answer the questions directly. Don't elaborate unless asked. Look at the jury when you speak, they're the ones who need to hear you. And Diane, she put her hand on mine, it's okay to cry. It's okay to show emotion. You're a mother who lost her son. The jury needs to see that pain is real. I don't know if I can do this. Yes, you can. You're the strongest person in this courtroom. Let them see that strength. At 9:15 a.m., after the morning's preliminary witnesses had finished, Judge Miller called, "The state may call its next witness." Rebecca stood. "The state calls Diane Foster." My legs felt like water as I walked to the witness stand. Every eye in that courtroom followed me. The jury watched with expressions ranging from sympathy to intense curiosity. Richard sat at the defense table, his head bowed, refusing to look at me. Good. I didn't want to see his face anyway. The bailiff held out a Bible. "Please place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do." My voice came out stronger than I expected. I sat down. The witness chair was uncomfortable, positioned so I faced both the jury and the lawyers. Behind them I could see Patricia in the gallery, Eleanor beside her, both giving me encouraging nods. Rebecca approached with a gentle expression. "Good morning, Mrs. Foster. Can you please state your full name for the record?" "Deanne Marie Foster." "And what is your relationship to the defendant?" I looked directly at Richard for the first time. He was staring at his hands, his shoulders hunched. He was my husband. We were married for 32 years. I've filed for divorce. "Can you tell the jury about your son, Michael?" This was the part I'd been dreading. Talking about Michael in past tense, reducing his beautiful, complicated life to testimony in a murder trial. Michael Robert Foster was my only child. He was 28 years old when he died. He worked as a software engineer at Amazon. He loved hiking, kayaking on Lake Union, terrible science fiction movies. My voice cracked. He called me every Sunday morning just to chat. He was kind and brilliant, and he deserved to live a long, happy life. Several jurors' eyes were already moist. When did Michael meet Vanessa Chen? About 2 years ago at a work conference. He was so happy when he introduced her to us. He said she was smart and funny and made him feel like the luckiest man alive. Did you approve of their relationship? Yes. I wanted Michael to be happy. I welcomed Vanessa into our family. I helped pay for their wedding, bought furniture for their house, treated her like the daughter I never had. The bitterness in my voice was impossible to hide. When did you first become aware of an affair between your husband Richard and your daughter-in-law Vanessa? I took a deep breath. October 26th, 5 days after Michael died. I couldn't sleep. I went to Richard's office at 2 a.m. and opened his laptop. I found browser history, hotels, jewelry, divorce lawyers, and I found a draft email to Vanessa. What did the email say? V. I can't keep doing this. Michael is my son. We've gone too far. We need to stop before someone gets hurt. My hands trembled. It was dated October 17th, 3 days before Michael died. What did you do after finding this email? I went through more of his computer files. I found months of emails and text messages between Richard and Vanessa, explicit messages about their affair, messages about how they couldn't wait to be together. Messages about money, how much Michael's life insurance was worth, how much their house was worth. They'd calculated it, $2.4 million. That's what my son's life was worth to them. I was crying now, tears streaming down my face, but my voice remained steady. I found bank records showing Richard had withdrawn $193,000 from our accounts, money we'd saved over 32 years of marriage, money my first husband left me when he died, money that was supposed to be for our retirement. Richard spent it all on hotels and gifts for Vanessa and paying people to help him plan murders. Objection, Hendricks called. The witness is characterizing. Overruled. This is the witness's testimony about what she discovered. Continue, Mrs. Foster. The worst part, I said, looking directly at the jury now, was realizing they'd been planning this for months. This wasn't a spontaneous act or a terrible accident. They researched. They calculated. They waited for the right moment. And then they drugged my son, filled him with enough sleeping pills to sedate a horse, and watched him drive to his death. Mrs. Foster, did you confront Richard after finding this evidence? Yes. That same night. He was in our kitchen. I asked him how long the affair had been going on. He said 6 months. I asked if he was involved in Michael's death. He denied it at first, but I could see the guilt on his face, the panic. He knew I'd figured it out. What happened next? I called the police. Detective Morrison came to our house. Richard tried to stop me from calling, tried to grab the phone from my hand. He was desperate. Because he knew once the police started investigating, they'd find everything. Rebecca walked to the evidence table and picked up a thick folder. Mrs. Foster, I'm showing you State's Exhibit 47. Do you recognize this? I looked at the pages Richard's 23-page confession letter. Yes. Richard sent this to me from jail about 2 months ago. It's his confession. He wrote out everything: how the affair started, how they planned Michael's murder, how they were also planning to kill me. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Even though this information had been reported in the news, hearing it stated in court had a different impact. He was planning to kill you too? Yes, they'd already paid Marcus Webb $78,000 for information on how to cause cardiac arrest that would look natural. Richard wrote in this letter that they were going to wait a few months after Michael died. Let me grieve, let me get weak from the stress, and then inject me with insulin to cause a heart attack. They'd already calculated that between Michael's insurance money and my life insurance, $350,000 plus our house and assets, they'd have almost $4 million total. One juror, a woman in her 50s, was openly crying now. Mrs. Foster, I need to ask you something difficult. In the months before Michael died, did you notice anything unusual about Richard's behavior? Looking back, yes. He was on his phone constantly, always texting someone he claimed was from his model train club. He was gone from the house for hours at a time when he said he was at meetings. He withdrew emotionally from me. We barely talked anymore, but I thought that was just normal for a long marriage, for people getting older. I never imagined he was having an affair with our son's wife. I never imagined he was capable of murder. Did Michael try to warn you about what was happening? Yes. My voice broke completely. About 6 weeks before he died, Michael called me. He asked if I thought Vanessa was happy with him. He said she'd been distant, always on her phone. He asked if Richard talked about her a lot. He was trying to tell me something was wrong, and I couldn't continue. Sobs racked my body. Judge Miller called for a brief recess. Patricia rushed to the witness stand and held me while I cried. When we reconvened 10 minutes later, I'd composed myself enough to continue. I'm sorry, I said to the jury. My son tried to warn me, and I didn't listen. I told him he was probably just stressed, that he should talk to Vanessa, that communication was important in marriage. I sent him back to the people who were planning to kill him. If I'd listened, if I'd paid attention, maybe he'd still be alive. Mrs. Foster, you are not responsible for what happened to Michael. Do you understand that? Intellectually, yes. But as a mother, I looked at Richard finally, let him see the full force of my rage and grief. As a mother, I will never forgive myself for not protecting my son from his father. From the man who should have loved him more than anyone in the world. Richard was crying now too, his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. But I felt nothing for him. No sympathy. No forgiveness. Just a vast, cold emptiness where my love for him used to be. Rebecca asked a few more questions about Michael's childhood, about the kind of man he'd been, painting a picture of a life full of promise that had been violently stolen. Then she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Foster. No further questions." Malcolm Hendricks stood for cross-examination. I braced myself. Mrs. Foster, I'm sorry for your loss. I truly am, but I need to ask you some difficult questions. Ask them. Isn't it true that your marriage to Richard had been troubled for years before Michael's death? We'd grown apart, yes, that happens in long marriages, but we weren't troubled enough for murder. But you just testified that you and Richard barely talked anymore, that he'd withdrawn emotionally. Doesn't that suggest a man who was deeply unhappy in his marriage? Being unhappy doesn't justify having an affair with your son's wife. It doesn't justify murder. But it might explain why a man in his 60s, feeling invisible and unwanted, might make terrible choices when a younger woman showed him attention? Objection, Rebecca called. Counsel is testifying, not asking questions. Sustained. Mr. Hendricks, please ask actual questions. Mrs. Foster, did you know that Richard tried to end the affair with Vanessa multiple times? I know he claimed that in his letter. I don't believe him. Why not? Because the text messages show them planning Michael's murder together. You don't plan to kill your son with someone you're trying to break up with. You don't research insurance payouts and murder methods with someone you want to leave. Those are the actions of partners, of co-conspirators. Hendricks frowned. I'd given a better answer than he'd hoped for. He tried a different approach. Mrs. Foster, isn't it possible that you're so consumed by grief and anger that you're seeing the worst possible interpretation of everything? That maybe Richard made terrible mistakes but didn't actually intend for Michael to die? I leaned forward, looking Hendricks directly in the eyes. My husband sent 8 crushed Ambien pills into my son's drink. He followed Michael's car onto the freeway knowing Michael was impaired. He stood by and watched while his son crashed into a concrete barrier at 70 miles per hour. Then he came home and comforted me while I cried over our dead child, knowing the entire time that he'd killed him. My voice rose. There is no interpretation of those facts that isn't murder. There is no version of that story where Richard is anything other than a monster who killed his own child for money. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Hendricks had no response. After a long pause, he said, "No further questions." As I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt lighter somehow. I'd told the truth. I'd spoken for Michael. I'd made sure that jury heard from someone who loved him exactly what had been taken from this world when Richard and Vanessa decided his life was worth less than insurance money. Judge Miller adjourned for the day. As I left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, but I had nothing more to say. I'd said everything that mattered on that witness stand. Tonight, I would sleep better than I had in months, because I'd kept my promise to Michael. I'd told his story, and I'd made sure they couldn't hide from what they'd done. Day 8 of the trial began with an announcement that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Malcolm Hendricks stood and declared, "Your Honor, the defense calls Richard Thomas Foster to testify." It was a massive gamble. Criminal defendants rarely testify because it opens them to cross-examination by the prosecution. But Hendricks clearly believed Richard's only chance was to humanize himself, to look the jury in the eye and sell the narrative of a manipulated, broken man. Richard took the stand wearing a different suit today, gray, somber, deliberately humble. He'd lost even more weight since the trial began, his face gaunt and haggard. When he placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, his voice trembled. Hendricks began gently, like a therapist with a traumatized patient. "Richard, tell the jury about your life before you met Vanessa Chen." "I was married to Diane for 32 years. We had a good life, not perfect, but good. We raised our son Michael together after Diane's first husband died. I tried to be a good father to him, a good stepfather. He caught himself. Actually, no, I was his father. I raised him from the time he was 16. I loved him like my own. What happened when you retired 2 years ago?" Richard's voice cracked. I fell apart. "I know that sounds dramatic, but it's true. For 40 years, I was a civil engineer. I built things. I solved problems. I was respected, needed. Then suddenly I was home all day with nothing to do. Diane had her volunteer work, her book club, her friends. I had nothing. I felt invisible. Useless, like I was just waiting to die." Several jurors nodded sympathetically. Hendricks was playing them perfectly. "When did you meet Vanessa Chen?" "At Michael's office Christmas party 2 Decembers ago. She was new to Seattle, didn't know many people. We talked about the city, about adjusting to life here after moving from California. She was kind, attentive. She made me feel seen again." Richard wiped his eyes. "I know how pathetic that sounds. A 64-year-old man feeling flattered by a young woman's attention. But I was drowning, and she threw me a lifeline, or what I thought was a lifeline." "When did your relationship with Vanessa become inappropriate?" "About 4 months after Michael married her. She called me one afternoon crying, said she and Michael had fought, that she was lonely. Could we meet for coffee? I should have said no. God, I should have said no." Richard put his face in his hands. "But I went, and she told me she'd made a terrible mistake marrying Michael. She said he was cold, never home, obsessed with his career. She said she felt trapped." "What did you do?" "I tried to comfort her. And then I kissed her. It was wrong. It was the worst thing I've ever done. Or so I thought then. I didn't know it would lead to something so much worse." "Did the relationship continue?" "Yes. For 11 months. We met at hotels. We texted constantly. She told me she loved me, that we were meant to be together, that age didn't matter. She made me feel young again, alive. Richard looked directly at the jury. I know you're judging me. You should. I was a selfish, foolish old man having an affair with my son's wife. But I never wanted to hurt Michael. He was my boy. I loved him. When did you first learn that Michael suspected the affair? In early October. Vanessa told me Michael had been acting strange, asking questions, checking her phone. She was panicking. She said if Michael found out, he'd divorce her and she'd have nothing. She'd lose the house, the lifestyle, everything. She begged me to help her. Help her how? Richard took a deep breath. She said we needed to discredit Michael if he tried to expose us, make him seem unstable, maybe paranoid. She suggested we could make him look like he was drinking too much, not thinking clearly. I said absolutely not. I wouldn't do anything to hurt my son's reputation or his career. What happened next? Vanessa became more insistent, more desperate. She told me Michael had hired a private investigator, that he had photos of us together, that he was planning to go to Diane and to his work and destroy both of us. She said Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. She said there was only one way out. Did you understand what she meant? Not at first, but then she spelled it out. She said if Michael was gone, all our problems disappeared. I told her she was insane. I told her I would never hurt Michael. I tried to end things with her right then. Why didn't you? Because she threatened me. Richard looked up, tears streaming down his face. She said if I left her, she'd go to the police and claim I'd been forcing myself on her. That I'd threatened her. That I'd stolen money from my wife's accounts, which was true. I had taken money for our affair and she'd testify against me. She said I'd go to prison and lose everything while Michael would hate me forever. She had me trapped. I wanted to scream. This was all lies calculated, manipulative lies designed to shift blame entirely onto Vanessa. I gripped Patricia's hand so hard I thought I'd break her fingers. Richard, tell the jury about the night of October 20th. Vanessa called me that afternoon. She said Michael had confronted her, said he knew everything, that he was going to the police the next morning. She was hysterical. She begged me to meet them for dinner, said maybe if we all talked together we could work something out. I agreed because I thought maybe I could reason with Michael, convince him not to destroy Diane by telling her about the affair. What happened at dinner? We met at the restaurant on Capitol Hill around 7 p.m. Michael was so angry, he had every right to be. He said he'd known for weeks, that he'd gathered evidence, that he was going to tell Diane everything the next morning. I tried to apologize, tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. Richard's voice broke. He looked at me with such hatred. My own son, looking at me like I was a stranger, like I was nothing. Did anything unusual happen during dinner? Vanessa went to the bathroom at one point. When she came back, she was calmer. She ordered drinks for all of us, wine for her and Michael, bourbon for me. We kept talking, or trying to talk, but Michael just got angrier, and then he started slurring his words, getting confused. I thought he was just drunk from the wine. Did you put anything in Michael's drink? This was the critical moment. Richard could either confess and claim it was Vanessa's idea, or deny it completely. He chose a middle ground. I didn't know what was in the drink. Vanessa had been carrying pills in her purse. She said they were for anxiety. Later, after everything happened, I realized she must have put something in Michael's wine while I wasn't looking. But in that moment, I just thought he'd had too much to drink. What happened after dinner? Vanessa suggested she and Michael go home, talk more in the morning when everyone was calmer. Michael agreed. I watched them walk to his car. I thought that was the end of it. Richard covered his face with his hands. I went home. I went to bed. And then at midnight, I got a call from Vanessa saying there'd been an accident, that Michael had crashed, that he was dead. You didn't follow them onto the freeway? No, I wasn't there. I didn't know Vanessa was planning anything. I thought Michael was just driving home. Richard looked directly at the jury, his eyes red and pleading. I know you don't believe me. I know the evidence looks damning. But I swear on everything I hold sacred, I did not intend for my son to die. When I got that call saying he was gone, I fell apart. I loved that boy more than life itself. Several jurors looked moved. Others remained skeptical. Hendricks had played it well, but Richard's story had too many convenient gaps. Richard, did you hire Marcus Webb to help plan murders? I hired him to give me information about my own end-of-life options. I'd been depressed, thinking about suicide after the affair started going wrong. I told him I wanted to know peaceful ways to die if it came to that. He must have misunderstood and thought I was asking about hurting other people. Another lie. The financial records showed the payment to Webb came after the affair was well established, not during some suicidal depression. Why didn't you go to the police after Michael died if you believed Vanessa was responsible? Because I was terrified. She'd threatened me before. I knew if I accused her, she'd say I'd planned everything. She'd say I was the mastermind, and she was the victim, so I stayed quiet. And every day since, I've hated myself for that cowardice. Hendricks concluded his direct examination. Richard, do you take responsibility for your role in this tragedy? Yes, completely. I had an affair with my son's wife. I betrayed my family. I made terrible, selfish choices. I deserve to be punished for those choices. Richard looked at me for the first time since taking the stand. Diane, if you're listening, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. I destroyed our family. I destroyed our son's life. I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to understand how I became this person. It was a good performance. Calculated, emotional, strategic. But it was still a performance. Now it was Rebecca Chen's turn, and she was going to tear him apart. Mr. Foster, she began, her voice cold as ice, you just testified that you didn't know Vanessa had put pills in Michael's drink. Is that correct? Yes. But you texted Vanessa at 6:43 p.m. that night before you even arrived at the restaurant saying, "Did you get the stuff ready? What stuff were you referring to?" Richard faltered. I don't remember that text. Rebecca displayed it on the courtroom screens. There it was. In Richard's own words. The jury leaned forward, reading intently. Let me refresh your memory. You texted, "Did you get the stuff ready?" And Vanessa responded, "Yes." 8 pills crushed into powder. I'll do it when you distract him. Does that sound like someone who didn't know what was in the drink? That must have been about something else. Something I've forgotten. Something else? Your son died that night with 8 Ambien pills in his system, the exact number Vanessa mentioned in her text response. And you're saying that's a coincidence? Richard had no answer. Rebecca spent the next hour systematically destroying every claim Richard had made. She showed texts where he discussed insurance payouts, financial records proving he'd withdrawn money, specifically labeled for plans. Browser searches on his computer for how long until life insurance pays out after death. By the time she finished, Richard looked defeated, exposed, his carefully constructed narrative in ruins. Mr. Foster, you testified that you loved your son. Is that correct? Yes. Then explain to this jury how a father who loves his son calculates that son's death down to the dollar, how he researches murder methods, how he watches that son drive to his death and does nothing to stop it. Explain how that's love. I didn't. I never meant. You never meant for him to die? Or you never meant to get caught? Objection, Hendricks shouted. Withdrawn. No further questions. Richard stepped down from the stand looking broken. But it was too late. The damage was done. His testimony had backfired completely. As court adjourned for the day, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Hope that justice might actually be served. Day 12 of the trial arrived on a Friday morning in late January. The previous days had been filled with expert witnesses, character testimony from Michael's friends and colleagues, and damning evidence presented piece by piece until the prosecution's case was an unassailable fortress of facts. Now it was time for closing arguments, the final chance for both sides to synthesize everything the jury had heard into a coherent narrative. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Extra chairs had been brought in for the overflow crowd. Media representatives filled the back rows. I sat in my usual spot in the front, flanked by Patricia and Eleanor, wearing the same black dress I'd worn to Michael's funeral. Judge Miller called court to order at 9 a.m. sharp. The state may present its closing argument. Ada Rebecca Chen stood and walked to the center of the courtroom. She was dressed in a burgundy suit today, instead of her usual navy, a subtle psychological choice, suggesting passion and conviction rather than cold authority. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, making eye contact with each member, over the past 12 days, you've heard testimony from 23 witnesses. You've seen hundreds of pieces of evidence, text messages, financial records, medical reports, video recordings, and all of that evidence points to one inescapable conclusion. Richard Foster murdered his son Michael for money, in conspiracy with Michael's wife Vanessa Chen. She walked to the evidence table and picked up a printed timeline. Let me walk you through the facts one more time, because facts don't lie. People lie. Richard Foster lied on that witness stand. But facts don't lie. Rebecca pointed to the first entry on the timeline, August 15th. Richard Foster pays Marcus Webb $78,000 for information on how to kill people and make it look natural. Not for himself. The defense wants you to believe Richard was suicidal. But suicidal people don't research ways to cause heart attacks in others. They research their own deaths. She moved to the next entry, August 23rd. First text message between Richard and Vanessa discussing our future together and removing obstacles. What obstacles, Michael? Michael was the obstacle to their life together. Entry by entry, Rebecca walked through the evidence. September, more text discussing insurance policies and asset values. October 5th, browser searches on Richard's computer about Ambien dosages combined with alcohol. October 17th, Richard's email to Vanessa saying they'd gone too far and needed to stop before someone gets hurt. 3 days before Michael died. The defense wants you to believe Richard didn't know what Vanessa was planning that night. But look at this text. Rebecca displayed it on every screen in the courtroom. October 20th, 6:43 p.m. Richard texts Vanessa, "Did you get the stuff ready?" Vanessa responds, "Yes. 8 pills crushed into powder. I'll do it when you distract him." Richard responds, "Good. This ends tonight." She paused, letting that sink in. This ends tonight. Not our conversation ends tonight. Not the affair ends tonight. This Michael's life ends tonight. That's premeditation. That's conspiracy. That's first-degree murder. Rebecca's voice rose with controlled passion. The defense painted Richard as a foolish old man manipulated by a younger woman, but the evidence shows a calculating killer who planned every detail, who withdrew $193,000 to fund an affair and murder conspiracy, who researched how to kill not just his son, but also his wife, who stood by and watched as his drugged, impaired son drove away to certain death. She turned to face Richard directly. He looked away. Richard Foster sat on that witness stand and told you he loved his son. But love doesn't calculate insurance payouts. Love doesn't research murder methods. Love doesn't put 8 crushed sleeping pills in someone's drink. That's not love. That's evil. Rebecca walked back to the jury box. The defense will tell you to have sympathy for Richard, to consider his depression, his loneliness, his late-life crisis. But I ask you to have sympathy for the right person. Have sympathy for Michael Foster, a 28-year-old man with his whole life ahead of him, brutally murdered by his own father. Have sympathy for Diane Foster, who lost her only child and nearly lost her own life to these killers. Have sympathy for justice itself, which demands that those who plan and execute murder face the full consequences of their actions. She stood directly in front of the jury now, her voice dropping to something almost intimate. When you go back to that deliberation room, you're going to review all the evidence, and you're going to see that there's only one verdict supported by the facts: guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty on all counts, because Richard Foster is guilty, and the evidence proves it beyond any reasonable doubt. Thank you. She sat down. The courtroom remained silent for several seconds, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Judge Miller turned to the defense. "Mr. Hendricks, you may present your closing argument." Malcolm Hendricks stood slowly, projecting an air of sorrowful resignation. He walked to the jury box and leaned against it casually, as if having an intimate conversation with friends. "Folks, I'm not going to stand here and tell you Richard Foster is innocent of all wrongdoing. He's not. He had an affair with his daughter-in-law. That's terrible. It's a betrayal of his family. It's morally reprehensible. But terrible choices don't automatically equal murder." He began pacing, his tone conversational. "The prosecution wants you to believe that every text message, every financial transaction, every word Richard spoke was part of a grand murder conspiracy. But let me offer you an alternative interpretation, one that's equally supported by the evidence." Hendricks pulled up one of the text messages Rebecca had highlighted. Richard texts Vanessa, "Did you get the stuff ready?" The prosecution says that's about crushed Ambien pills. But what if it's about something else entirely? What if it's about documents Vanessa was supposed to bring, or photos, or any of 100 other things people discuss in text messages? "Objection, Your Honor," Rebecca called. "Counsel is asking the jury to speculate beyond the evidence." "Overruled. This is closing argument." Mr. Hendricks may argue reasonable interpretations of the evidence. Hendricks continued. "The prosecution showed you financial records. $193,000 withdrawn over 11 months. But none of those transactions show checks made out to hitmen. None of them show payments for murder weapons or getaway plans. They show hotels and restaurants and gifts. The spending of a man having an affair wrong, yes, but not murderous." He walked to the evidence board and pointed at the timeline. Marcus Webb testified that Richard asked about ways to cause heart attacks. But Webb also admitted he thought Richard was asking for his own suicide planning, not to kill others. Webb is a man who already pled guilty to conspiracy charges and has every reason to exaggerate Richard's involvement to reduce his own sentence. I felt my blood pressure rising. This was masterful manipulation, taking each piece of evidence and suggesting just enough doubt to make some jurors question the prosecution's narrative. And that brings me to the real culprit in this tragedy, Vanessa Chen. Hendricks's voice hardened. A master manipulator who seduced an older man going through a depression, who told him she was afraid of Michael, who controlled every aspect of their relationship through threats and manipulation, who planned Michael's death and executed it while making Richard believe they were just having a difficult conversation with Michael that night. He turned back to the jury. Richard Foster is guilty of infidelity. He's guilty of financial irresponsibility. He's guilty of making terrible, selfish choices that contributed to a tragedy. But is he guilty of premeditated murder? The prosecution hasn't proven that beyond a reasonable doubt. Hendricks walked to where Richard sat and placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture clearly calculated for the jury. This is a broken man. A man who will live with the consequences of his terrible choices for whatever life he has left. But he's not a cold-blooded killer. He's a foolish, lonely old man who got caught up with an evil woman and lost everything: his son, his wife, his freedom, his dignity. He turned back to the jury, his voice dropping to something almost pleading. "I'm not asking you to forgive Richard Foster. I'm asking you to look at the evidence and ask yourself, has the prosecution proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Richard intended to murder his son? Or is it possible, just possible, that he made terrible mistakes without understanding the full extent of what Vanessa was planning? If there's any reasonable doubt in your mind, then your oath as jurors requires you to find him not guilty." "Thank you." Hendricks sat down. Several jurors were nodding thoughtfully. He'd done his job, planted seeds of doubt, created an alternative narrative that some might find believable. But as I looked at the jurors' faces, I saw something else too. I saw the older woman in the front row shaking her head slightly, as if rejecting Hendricks's arguments. I saw a younger man writing notes with an expression of disgust. Not all of them were buying it. Judge Miller addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've now heard all the evidence and both closing arguments. I will now instruct you on the law you must apply to this case." She spent the next 40 minutes explaining the legal definitions of first-degree murder, conspiracy, reasonable doubt, and the burden of proof. Her instructions were clear and precise, giving the jury the framework they needed to deliberate. Finally, she said, "You will now retire to the jury room to begin your deliberations. Remember, you must reach a unanimous verdict. If you cannot reach unanimity, you must inform me and we'll discuss next steps. But you must make every effort to reach agreement based on the evidence." "Bailiff, please escort the jury." The 12 jurors and 4 alternates filed out. The clock read 11:45 a.m. The waiting had begun. Patricia gripped my hand. "How long do you think they'll be out?" "I have no idea. Hours? Days?" Rebecca Chen came over to where we Saturday. "The quick verdict theories are myths. Sometimes juries decide quickly, sometimes they take days. Try not to read anything into the timing. Just wait." Wait. As if that was simple. As if I could do anything else. We went to a small cafe near the courthouse for lunch, though I couldn't eat anything. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from friends and reporters asking for updates. I ignored them all. At 3:15 p.m., my phone rang with a call from the court liaison. "Mrs. Foster, The jury has reached a verdict. Please return to the courtroom. 3.5 hours. They deliberated for 3.5 hours. Patricia and I rushed back to the courthouse, our hearts pounding. The courtroom filled quickly, reporters sprinting to get seats, spectators pushing through security, everyone sensing that history was about to be made. At 3:30 p.m., Judge Miller took the bench. Richard was brought in, his face pale and drawn. He looked like a man facing a firing squad. The jury filed in. I tried to read their expressions but couldn't. Some looked solemn, others looked tired. None looked at Richard. Judge Miller addressed the jury foreman, a man in his early 50s wearing a cardigan. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. Please hand the verdict forms to the bailiff. The bailiff walked the papers to Judge Miller. She reviewed them, her expression unreadable, then handed them back. Will the defendant please rise? Richard stood on shaking legs, his attorney beside him. Judge Miller looked at the foreman. On the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find? The courtroom held its collective breath. The foreman's voice was clear and strong. We find the defendant guilty. The word guilty echoed through the courtroom like thunder. I collapsed forward, sobbing into my hands. Patricia held me while I shook. Around us, people were crying, gasping, some even applauding before Judge Miller gavelled for silence. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. Richard's legs gave out. He fell back into his chair, his face in his hands, his body convulsing with sobs. But I felt no sympathy. Only relief. Only justice. Only the knowledge that my son's death had been acknowledged, validated, avenged through the legal system. Judge Miller polled the jury. Each member confirmed the verdict individually. 12 voices saying guilty, 12 times. Mr. Foster, you have been found guilty on all counts. Sentencing will be scheduled for 6 weeks from today. You will remain in custody without bail. This court is adjourned. As they led Richard away in handcuffs, he looked at me one last time. And I looked back. Not with hatred anymore, not with rage, just with finality. It was over. This part, at least, was over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Mrs. Foster, how do you feel about the verdict? I stood on those courthouse steps, the same place I'd stood months ago demanding justice, and I spoke. Today, 12 jurors affirmed what I've known since the moment I discovered the truth. Richard Foster murdered our son Michael for money. The verdict doesn't bring Michael back. It doesn't heal my shattered heart. But it means that truth won. Justice won. And Michael's life mattered enough for the law to hold his killers accountable. That has to be enough. Thank you. That night, I slept for 12 hours straight, the first full night's sleep I'd had since October. Because my son could finally rest in peace knowing his father would spend the rest of his life in prison for what he'd done. Justice wasn't everything, but it was something. And something was more than I'd had before. 6 weeks after the guilty verdict, on March 5th, I returned to the King County Courthouse for Richard's sentencing hearing. The intervening weeks had been strange, a mixture of relief and continued grief, of sleeping better but waking with the same hollow ache in my chest that never quite went away. The divorce had been finalized in that time. I was no longer Diane Foster, wife of a murderer. I was just Diane Foster, mother of a murdered son, trying to figure out how to exist in a world that no longer made sense. The courtroom was less crowded today than during the trial. The media circus had moved on to other tragedies, though several camera crews remained to document the sentencing. I sat in my usual seat, Patricia beside me, waiting for the final chapter of Richard's case to close. Judge Miller took the bench at 9 a.m. precisely. We are here today for sentencing in the matter of the State of Washington versus Richard Thomas Foster. Mr. Foster has been found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Before I impose sentence, I will hear from the victim's family. Mrs. Foster, would you like to make a victim impact statement? I stood on trembling legs. Ada Chen had prepared me for this moment, helped me write a statement that captured the enormity of what had been taken from me. But when I reached the podium, I put the prepared speech aside and spoke from my heart. Your Honor, members of the court, I've spent months trying to find words adequate to describe what Richard Foster took from me when he murdered my son. But there are no adequate words. No language exists to capture the specific agony of a mother who buries her child, not because of accident or illness or tragedy, but because the child's own father calculated his death down to the dollar. If this part touched something deep inside you, hit that like button so I know it reached you. Do you see your own reflection in this character's journey? Tell me in the comments your story might just inspire someone else. My voice cracked, but I pushed forward. Michael Robert Foster was 28 years old. He had dreams. He wanted to travel to Japan someday. He was saving money to start his own software company. He talked about having children in a few years, about giving me grandchildren. All of that, every possibility, every potential moment was erased by Richard Foster's greed. I looked directly at Richard. He sat at the defense table, head bowed, refusing to meet my eyes. For 32 years, I believed I knew this man. I believed he was honorable, decent, capable of love. I was wrong about all of it. The man I thought I married never existed. In his place was someone who could look at his own son. A son he raised, taught to ride a bike, helped with homework, celebrated birthdays with, and decide that son was worth less than insurance money. Tears streamed down my face, but my voice remained steady. Your Honor, I ask that you impose the maximum sentence allowed by law. Not because it will bring Michael back, nothing can do that. Not because it will ease my pain, nothing can do that either. But because it will ensure that Richard Foster never walks free again. That he never has another moment of freedom while my son lies in a grave. That seems like the absolute minimum justice requires. I returned to my seat, emotionally exhausted. Judge Miller made notes on her pad, then looked up. Does the defendant wish to make a statement before sentencing? Malcolm Hendricks stood. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Foster would like to address the court. Richard rose slowly, gripping the table for support. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, broken and defeated. Your Honor, I don't expect anyone to forgive me. I don't forgive myself. I killed my son. I can say it was an accident, that I didn't mean for him to die, but those are just excuses. I made choices terrible, evil choices, and Michael died because of them. He turned slightly toward me, though he still couldn't look directly at me. Diane, I'm sorry, isn't enough. It's not even close to enough. But it's all I have. I'm sorry I destroyed our family. I'm sorry I took Michael from you. I'm sorry I wasn't the man you thought I was. I'm sorry for all of it. His voice broke completely. I loved Michael. I know you don't believe that. I know my actions prove otherwise. But it's true. And I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to understand how a father could do what I did to his own child. He sat down, weeping quietly. Judge Miller waited until he'd composed himself somewhat, then began her sentencing remarks. Mr. Foster, I've presided over criminal cases for 30 years. I've seen murderers of every variety, crimes of passion, gang violence, robbery gone wrong. But this case stands apart because of the profound betrayal at its heart. You murdered the person who trusted you most in this world. You murdered your own son for financial gain. That represents a level of depravity that shocks the conscience. She reviewed the sentencing guidelines, the aggravating factors, premeditation, financial motivation, abuse of family trust. Then she pronounced sentence. On the charge of first-degree murder, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, I sentence you to 25 years to run concurrent with your life sentence. You will spend the remainder of your natural life in custody of the Washington State Department of Corrections. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none. The gavel came down. Final. Irrevocable. Richard was led away in shackles. As he passed my row, he stopped briefly and looked at me one last time. I saw genuine remorse in his eyes, maybe, or maybe just self-pity at being caught. I would never know for certain, and I realized I didn't care anymore. He was gone from my life forever. That was all that mattered. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked their predictable questions. I gave a brief statement. Justice has been partially served today. Richard Foster will die in prison, as he deserves. But justice won't be complete until Vanessa Chen faces the same consequences. Her trial begins next month. I'll be there every day for that one too. Vanessa's trial was scheduled to begin on April 15th, 6 months to the day after Michael's murder. The prosecution's strategy was different this time. They couldn't use Richard's testimony since he'd invoked his Fifth Amendment rights and refused to testify against her. But they had all the physical evidence, all the text messages, and something even more powerful, the verdict and evidence from Richard's trial establishing that a murder had been planned and executed. The month between Richard's sentencing and Vanessa's trial felt endless. I spent my days going through Michael's belongings, finally packing up his childhood bedroom, donating his clothes to charity. Patricia thought I should sell the house, too many painful memories, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. I also met with a filmmaker who wanted to do a documentary about the case. At first I refused, but then I realized it might be a way to prevent other families from suffering what I'd suffered. If Michael's story could warn people about the dangers of elder financial abuse, about recognizing manipulation, about protecting vulnerable family members, then maybe his death could have some meaning beyond just tragedy. On April 14th, the night before Vanessa's trial began, I visited Michael's grave. The headstone had weathered the Seattle winter, moss beginning to grow on its north face. I knelt and cleared away dead leaves, placing fresh flowers, white roses, his favorite. "Tomorrow it starts again, baby," I said aloud. "Vanessa's trial. She's claiming she was a victim, that Richard forced her to do everything. But we know better, don't we? We know she was a partner in your murder. And I'm going to make sure that jury knows it too." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees. Somewhere nearby, a bird sang. Life continuing. Despite death. Despite grief. Despite the unbearable weight of loss. April 15th arrived cold and rainy. I wore the same black dress I'd worn to Richard's trial, my armor against the world. The courthouse felt familiar now. I knew which entrance had the shortest security line, which bathroom was cleanest, which vending machine had the best coffee. The courtroom for Vanessa's trial was the same one where Richard had been convicted. Same Judge Catherine Miller had been assigned both cases. Same prosecution team Rebecca Chen had promised me she'd fight just as hard to convict Vanessa. But the defense team was different. David Brennan was even more expensive than Malcolm Hendricks, with a reputation for winning impossible cases by turning female defendants into sympathetic victims. He specialized in domestic violence defenses, in painting abusive men as the real criminals, while his clients were merely trying to survive. At 9 a.m., Vanessa was brought into the courtroom. I hadn't seen her in person since the funeral, just photos in news coverage and court documents. She was visibly pregnant now, 7 months along, wearing a loose navy dress that emphasized her condition. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore no makeup. She looked young, vulnerable, scared. It was all calculated, of course. Every detail designed to make the jury see her as a victim rather than a killer. When her eyes found mine across the courtroom, something flickered in her expression. Fear? Defiance? Hatred? Then she looked away quickly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as if already crying. Judge Miller called court to order. "We are here today to begin jury selection in the matter of the State of Washington versus Vanessa Chen. Before we proceed, I want to address the elephant in the room, Miss / Elephant. Chen's co-defendant, Richard Foster, was convicted of first-degree murder in this same courtroom 2 months ago. That conviction is a matter of public record. However, Miss Chen is entitled to her own trial, her own presentation of evidence, and her own verdict based solely on evidence presented in this proceeding. Understood?" Everyone nodded or murmured agreement. The jury selection process took 2 full days, even longer than Richard's trial, because Brennan was meticulous about eliminating anyone who'd followed Richard's trial closely or who expressed strong opinions about pregnant defendants. By the end, they'd seated a jury that skewed younger and more female than Richard's jury, exactly what Brennan wanted. On day 3, opening statements began. Rebecca Chen stood before the jury with the same commanding presence she'd brought to Richard's trial. "Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant wants you to believe she's a victim, a young woman manipulated by an older, controlling man. But the evidence will show you something very different. Vanessa Chen wasn't a victim. She was a predator who seduced her father-in-law, planned her husband's murder, watched him die, and then tried to collect millions of dollars in life insurance. She's sitting here 7 months pregnant with Richard Foster's child, a pregnancy she initiated deliberately to trap him into committing murder. She's not a victim. She's a killer who happens to be pregnant." The prosecution's case unfolded over the next week. Much of it was identical to Richard's trial, the text messages, the financial records, the timeline of planning. But Rebecca also introduced new evidence. Testimony from Vanessa's college roommate about how Vanessa had once joked about marrying rich and removing obstacles if necessary. Testimony from a bartender at one of the hotels where Richard and Vanessa met, describing how Vanessa had drunkenly boasted about playing the long game to get what she wanted. And most damaging, recordings from Michael's hidden cameras showing Vanessa, alone in the house, practicing crying in front of a mirror, practicing her grieving widow performance. The courtroom gasped when those videos played, Vanessa dabbing her eyes, checking her reflection, trying different expressions of sorrow until she found one that looked authentic, then smiling at herself in satisfaction. It was chilling, calculated, evil. When the prosecution rested after 8 days of testimony, Brennan stood to present his defense, and I braced myself for the fight of my life, because Vanessa Chen was about to claim she was the real victim, and I was going to have to watch 12 jurors decide whether to believe her. Day 9 of Vanessa's trial began with David Brennan's opening witness, a domestic violence expert named Dr. Rebecca Fontaine, a professor from the University of Washington who'd written extensively about coercive control and psychological manipulation in relationships. Dr. Fontaine was in her 50s, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave her an academic authority. She spoke calmly, methodically, as Brennan guided her through her credentials and research. Dr. Fontaine, can you explain to the jury what coercive control means in the context of domestic relationships? Certainly. Coercive control is a pattern of behavior where one partner systematically dominates another through isolation, intimidation, threats, and manipulation. Unlike physical abuse, which leaves visible marks, coercive control operates psychologically. The victim may appear to participate willingly in actions, but in reality, they're operating under severe psychological duress. Can significant age differences between partners contribute to coercive control? Absolutely. When a younger person enters a relationship with someone significantly older, especially someone with more financial resources, life experience, and established authority, there's an inherent power imbalance. The older partner can exploit that imbalance to control the younger one. I felt my jaw clench. This was the strategy: paint Richard as an evil puppeteer and Vanessa as his helpless marionette. Brennan showed Dr. Fontaine the text messages between Richard and Vanessa. Looking at these communications, do you see evidence of coercive control? Dr. Fontaine studied them through her glasses. Yes. Notice the language patterns. Richard frequently uses directives, "You need to," "You will," "Make sure you." Vanessa's responses are often deferential, seeking approval. There's a clear dominant-submissive dynamic. Objection, Rebecca Chen called. The witness is speculating about psychological states without having evaluated either party directly. Your Honor, Dr. Fontaine is providing expert analysis of communication patterns, which is within her expertise, Brennan argued. I'll allow it, but the jury should understand this is expert opinion based on limited information, not a clinical diagnosis. Proceed. Dr. Fontaine continued. In relationships with coercive control, victims often participate in illegal or immoral activities at their abuser's direction. They may appear complicit, but they're acting under psychological coercion, afraid of what will happen if they refuse. Could a victim of coercive control help plan a murder? Unfortunately, yes. We've seen cases where domestic violence victims assist in crimes because they believe they have no choice. The abuser convinces them that if they don't comply, something worse will happen to them or to others they care about. It was masterful manipulation of psychology and sympathy. Several jurors were nodding, particularly 2 younger women who might identify with the narrative of a woman trapped by an older man's control. Rebecca Chen's cross-examination was sharp. Dr. Fontaine, you never met Vanessa Chen, correct? That's correct. You never conducted a psychological evaluation of her? No. So your testimony is based entirely on reviewing selected text messages and emails without ever speaking to the defendant or observing her behavior? That's accurate, yes. But the patterns I identified are consistent with, Doctor, yes or no, did you review the video recordings where Vanessa Chen practices crying in front of a mirror, where she rehearses her grief? Dr. Fontaine hesitated. I was shown those videos, yes. And would someone under coercive control typically practice their emotional responses alone, perfecting their performance? Well, victims sometimes do engage in anticipatory behaviors. That's not what I asked. Would a victim practice fake crying in front of a mirror? That's more complicated. It could indicate, "Thank you, doctor. No further questions." The damage was done, but not completely undone. Dr. Fontaine's testimony had planted seeds of doubt. Maybe Vanessa was manipulated. Maybe she was afraid. Maybe she wasn't as culpable as the prosecution claimed. The next witness shook me to my core. Brennan called Catherine Chen, Vanessa's sister, the woman I'd seen recording the funeral. Catherine took the stand wearing a somber gray suit, her face already tear-stained. She looked so much like Vanessa, same delicate features, same large eyes, but without the calculated coldness I'd come to recognize in my former daughter-in-law. "Catherine, can you tell the jury about your sister's relationship with Richard Foster?" Brennan asked gently. Vanessa was terrified of him, Catherine said, her voice trembling. She would call me crying, saying Richard had threatened her. He told her if she tried to leave him or expose their affair, he'd destroy her reputation. He'd tell everyone she seduced him. He'd make sure Michael divorced her and left her with nothing. Did Vanessa want to end the affair? Many times. But Richard wouldn't let her. He said Catherine's voice broke. He said if she didn't do exactly what he told her, he'd kill Michael and make it look like Vanessa was responsible. She was trapped. I wanted to scream. This was fiction. Pure, calculated fiction designed to save a murderer. Did you believe your sister was in danger? Yes. I told her to go to the police, but she said Richard had connections, that no one would believe her. She said he'd already stolen money from his wife and gotten away with it. That he was smarter than everyone. She was terrified. Brennan showed Catherine some of the text messages. When Vanessa writes about our future together, what do you think she meant? I think Richard had convinced her that going along with his plans was the only way she'd survive. That if she played along, acted like she wanted to be with him, maybe he wouldn't hurt her too. Rebecca Chen's cross-examination was brutal. "Miss Chen, did your sister ever report Richard's alleged threats to police?" "No, she was too scared." "Did she tell any friends about these threats?" "I don't know, maybe." "Did she tell her husband Michael about these threats?" "She couldn't. Richard said he'd kill Michael if she did." "Convenient," Rebecca said dryly. "Miss Chen, you testified that your sister called you crying multiple times. Can you provide phone records proving these calls occurred?" Catherine faltered. I don't have my old phone anymore." "How convenient. Miss Chen, isn't it true that you posted on social media after Richard's conviction, saying, 'My sister is innocent and I'll do whatever it takes to prove it'?" "I was just supporting my sister." "Including lying on the witness stand?" "Objection," Brennan shouted. "Counsel is badgering the witness." "Sustained. Miss Chen, rephrase." "Miss Chen, are you lying to protect your sister?" "No, everything I said is true. Vanessa is a victim." But the jury looked skeptical now. Catherine's testimony was too convenient, too perfectly aligned with the defense strategy, without any corroboration. Then came the moment I'd been dreading. Brennan called Vanessa to testify in her own defense. She walked to the witness stand slowly, one hand protectively on her pregnant belly. She wore a simple blue dress, maternal, innocent. When she placed her hand on the Bible to swear the oath, her hand trembled visibly. Brennan began gently, establishing her background. Born in California to immigrant parents, worked hard to get through college, came to Seattle for her marketing job at Amazon. She painted herself as ambitious but naive, a small-town girl overwhelmed by big city life. "When did you first meet Richard Foster?" "At Michael's office Christmas party. Michael introduced me to his parents. Richard was so kind, so warm. He made me feel welcome to the family." Vanessa's voice was soft, almost childlike. "When did your relationship with Richard become inappropriate?" "I didn't want it to become inappropriate. Richard started texting me, saying he wanted to give me advice about fitting into Seattle culture, about navigating Michael's family. At first it was innocent, but then the messages became more personal, more intimate." "Did you encourage this?" "No. I tried to create distance, but Richard would show up at my workplace. He'd call me when Michael was traveling. He said I reminded him of his youth, made him feel alive again. I felt sorry for him. He seemed so lonely." I gripped Patricia's hand until my knuckles were white. Every word out of Vanessa's mouth was poison wrapped in sympathy. "When did the relationship become sexual?" Vanessa looked down, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Richard came to our house one day when Michael was at work. He kissed me. I tried to push him away, but he was so much stronger. He said if I didn't cooperate, he'd tell Michael I'd been trying to seduce him, that Michael would believe his father over me. I felt trapped. Objection! Rebecca was on her feet. The defendant is accusing a man who cannot defend himself of assault without any corroborating evidence. Your Honor, this is the defendant's testimony about her experience. She has a right to present her defense. Judge Miller considered. I'll allow it, but the jury should note that these allegations cannot be verified. Vanessa continued, describing a relationship of increasing control and fear. Richard allegedly threatened her constantly, monitored her phone, demanded she account for every moment. She claimed he stole from Diane's accounts to fund their affair, then threatened to blame Vanessa for the theft if she tried to leave. When did Richard first mention killing Michael? 3 months before it happened, he said Michael suspected the affair, that Michael was going to ruin everything. Richard said we had to make Michael disappear, or we'd both go to prison for the financial fraud. Vanessa's voice broke completely. I said absolutely not. I loved Michael. He was my husband. But Richard said if I didn't help, he'd kill me too. He said no one would believe me if I went to the police, that I'd already participated in the affair, already benefited from the stolen money, that I was already complicit. Did you believe him? Yes. I was terrified. Richard was 66 years old, so much older, so much more experienced. He seemed to know exactly what to do, how to plan everything. I felt like I had no choice but to go along, or I'd be killed too. Tell the jury about the night Michael died. Vanessa took a shaky breath. Richard told me to meet them for dinner at the restaurant. He said he'd handle everything, that I just needed to act normal. During dinner, Richard put something in Michael's drink while I was in the bathroom. I didn't know he was going to do that. When we left the restaurant, Michael was confused, sleepy. Richard told me to get in the car with Michael, drive partway home, then fake car trouble so Michael would pull over. He said he'd follow us and we'd figure out what to do. Did you know Richard planned for Michael to crash? No. I thought we were just going to talk to him, maybe convince him the affair wasn't real. But when we got on the freeway, Michael was driving so erratically. I was scared. I told him to pull over, that I felt sick. He did. I got out. And then Richard pulled up behind us and told me to get in his car. I said, "What about Michael?" And Richard said, "He's taken care of." I didn't understand what that meant until Michael drove away and I saw how impaired he was. Vanessa was sobbing now. I screamed at Richard to stop him, to call 911, but Richard said it was too late, that if we interfered now we'd both go to prison. He said we had to let it play out. And then Michael crashed? Yes. We heard the impact. It was the worst sound I've ever heard. I wanted to run to him, but Richard wouldn't let me. He said I had to act like I'd been in the car. He cut my forehead with something I still don't know what. He drove me partway to a gas station, told me to call for help, to say I'd been in the crash. I was in shock. I just did what he said. It was the performance of a lifetime. Vanessa crying, holding her pregnant belly, looking so young and vulnerable and victimized. And I could see it working. Several jurors looked sympathetic. They were believing her. When Rebecca Chen stood for cross-examination, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. This was the moment that would decide everything. Miss Chen, you testified that Richard forced you into a sexual relationship. Is that correct? Yes. Yet you texted him multiple times saying, "I love you, and I can't wait to be with you." Were you forced to send those texts? I was trying to placate him, to make him think I was cooperating so he wouldn't hurt me. You texted him on September 15th. How much longer until we're free? I'm tired of pretending to love M. That's Michael, your husband. Were you forced to write that? Vanessa hesitated. Richard had my phone. He sometimes sent texts from my account to make it look like I was willingly participating. So Richard sent that text from your phone? Yes, or he made me write it while he watched. Rebecca pulled out phone records. Interesting, because that text was sent at 2:47 p.m. on September 15th. According to Richard's credit card records, he was at a dental appointment in Bellevue at that time, 30 miles away from where you worked. So how did he send a text from your phone while he was in a dentist's chair? Vanessa's face paled. Maybe I'm misremembering which text. Miss Chen, you practiced crying in front of a mirror. We have video of you doing that. Why would a terrified victim practice fake emotions? I was rehearsing how to hide my fear from Richard. Or rehearsing how to fool everyone else? Rebecca's voice was steel. Miss Chen, you're 7 months pregnant with Richard's child. When did that pregnancy begin? Around July or August. You got pregnant in the middle of planning a murder. Did Richard force you to get pregnant? He didn't use protection. You're a 29-year-old woman with access to birth control. Did Richard physically prevent you from accessing contraception? He said if I didn't get pregnant, he'd know I wasn't really committed to him. So you deliberately got pregnant with your father-in-law's child while married to his son, while planning to murder that son. And you want this jury to believe you're a victim? The courtroom was silent. Vanessa had no answer. Rebecca continued for another hour, systematically destroying every claim Vanessa made, pointing out contradictions, showing evidence that Vanessa had initiated contact with Richard as often as he'd initiated with her, proving that Vanessa had researched divorce law and insurance policies on her own computer. By the time cross-examination ended, Vanessa looked defeated. Her mask had slipped. The jury had seen glimpses of the calculating killer beneath the victim performance. But would it be enough? Would 12 people see through her lies the way I did? Or would a pregnant woman's tears be more powerful than evidence? I wouldn't know until the verdict came in. And the waiting was killing me all over again. The jury deliberated for 4 days. 4 agonizing days where I barely ate, barely slept, constantly replaying Vanessa's testimony in my mind, wondering if her tears had been convincing enough to sway even one juror toward sympathy. On the afternoon of the 4th day, April 30th, my phone rang. The court liaison's voice was calm but urgent. Mrs. Foster, the jury has reached a verdict. Please return to the courtroom immediately. Patricia drove me to the courthouse through heavy Seattle rain. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. What if they believe her? I whispered. What if they think she was just a victim? Then we appeal, Patricia said firmly. We fight until there's nothing left to fight with. But Diane, I saw those jurors' faces during Rebecca's cross-examination. They saw through her lies. Have faith. Faith. I'd lost most of mine over the past 7 months. But I held on to a small, desperate hope that 12 strangers had seen what I saw, a calculated killer hiding behind pregnancy and tears. The courtroom filled quickly. At 3:15 p.m., Judge Miller took the bench. Vanessa was brought in, her pregnant belly even more pronounced now. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying, her hands trembling as she gripped the defense table. The jury filed in. I searched their faces desperately for any sign of their decision. Several looked directly at Vanessa with expressions I couldn't quite read. Others stared straight ahead, solemn and resolved. Judge Miller addressed the jury foreman, a woman in her early 60s, a retired teacher. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. The bailiff retrieved the verdict forms. Judge Miller reviewed them, her expression revealing nothing, then handed them back. Will the defendant please rise? Vanessa stood on shaking legs, one hand supporting her belly, the other gripping Brennan's arm for support. She looked so young, so vulnerable. For a moment, just a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered Michael's face in that morgue. The sound of my son's voice on the recording saying, "Dad, I know about you and Vanessa." The text messages where she'd calculated his life's worth in dollars. The sympathy evaporated. On the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find? The courtroom held its breath. Every eye fixed on the jury foreman. We find the defendant guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Vanessa's legs buckled. She collapsed into her chair, hands over her face, body convulsing with sobs that might have been real this time. But I felt no satisfaction, only a hollow relief, only the knowledge that justice, incomplete, inadequate justice, had been served again. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. Judge Miller polled each juror individually. 12 voices, one after another, confirming, guilty, guilty, guilty. Not a single dissenting vote. The jury had seen through Vanessa's performance completely. As the judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later and adjourned the court, I sat motionless, tears streaming down my face. Patricia held me. Eleanor, who'd attended every day of both trials, squeezed my shoulder from the row behind. "It's over," Patricia whispered. "It's finally over." But it wasn't over. Not really. Michael was still dead. I was still alone. The hole in my heart where my son used to be was still a gaping, bleeding wound that would never fully heal. Justice didn't bring him back. It just meant his killers would pay for what they'd done. 6 weeks later, on June 11th, I returned for Vanessa's sentencing. She'd given birth 3 days earlier, a baby girl, delivered in the prison medical facility under guard. The child had been immediately placed with Vanessa's parents in California. Vanessa would likely never hold her daughter again outside prison walls. I should have felt triumph at that. Instead, I just felt sad. Sad for a baby born into such darkness. Sad for the grandmother and grandfather who'd have to explain someday why their daughter was in prison for murder. Vanessa stood before Judge Miller, looking gaunt and hollow, her pregnancy over, her performance unnecessary now. When asked if she wanted to make a statement, she declined. No more lies. No more manipulation. Just silence. Judge Miller's words were harsh and final. Vanessa Chen, you seduced your husband's father. You planned and executed your husband's murder for financial gain. You attempted to profit from your own crime. You showed no genuine remorse. Only calculated performance designed to evade responsibility. I sentence you to life in prison without possibility of parole. You will never know freedom again. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell. Vanessa was led away. And I walked out of that courthouse for the last time, feeling older than my 77 years but somehow also lighter. It was truly over now. Both killers would die in prison. Michael's death had been acknowledged, validated, punished to the fullest extent the law allowed. I stood on the courthouse steps one final time, facing the cameras, and I spoke not just to reporters but to everyone watching, to families everywhere who might face similar betrayals. Today marks the end of the longest, darkest chapter of my life. Richard Foster and Vanessa Chen have both been convicted and sentenced to life in prison for murdering my son Michael. But I want to share something with all of you watching this, something I've learned through this nightmare. I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. This is a story about knowledge, the knowledge we ignore when warning signs appear. The knowledge I should have had when my marriage felt distant, when my son expressed concerns, when financial records didn't quite add up. Knowledge is power, but only if we act on it. That's the first lesson here, the first piece of knowledge we must embrace. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. This is also a story about education, educating ourselves about elder financial abuse, about recognizing manipulation in families, about protecting vulnerable people from those who see them as resources rather than human beings. We need better education in our communities about these dangers. We need to educate our children to value human life over money, to understand that no amount of wealth justifies betrayal or violence. I felt my voice strengthen as I continued. The knowledge that kept me silent, the knowledge that good wives don't question their husbands, that good mothers-in-law don't interfere in their children's marriages, that false knowledge nearly cost me my life too. We need better knowledge, better education about healthy family relationships, about when to speak up, about how to protect ourselves and those we love. This case provides crucial knowledge about the warning signs of family murder conspiracies, the sudden financial withdrawals, the secretive behavior, the isolation from friends and family. These are lessons painful, lessons that I hope will educate others to recognize danger before it's too late. I've learned lessons about grief, about justice, about the importance of fighting for truth even when it's easier to stay silent. These lessons, this knowledge, this education in the hardest possible way, I share them all with you now, so that Michael's death might prevent other tragedies. I wiped tears from my face. To everyone watching, educate yourself about your family's finances. Don't ignore warning signs. Don't let politeness or fear prevent you from asking difficult questions. The knowledge you gain might save your life or the life of someone you love. That's the educational value of this tragedy, that awareness and action can prevent similar horrors. Michael deserved better than what happened to him. He deserved parents who valued his life above their own selfish desires. He deserved to grow old, to have children, to live the life he'd worked so hard to build. I couldn't save him, but maybe by sharing our story, I can save someone else's child. As I finished speaking, I felt Patricia's steadying hand on my arm. The cameras captured everything, my tears, my pain, but also my resolve. That night, I began writing. Not just a victim impact statement or court testimony, but a book about what happened to Michael, about the warning signs I'd missed, about financial abuse in families, about how greed destroys everything it touches. If Michael's story could educate even one person, help them recognize danger, save one life, then maybe his death would have meaning beyond just tragedy. 3 years have passed since that day on the courthouse steps. I'm 80 years old now. I sold the house in Seattle, too many painful memories, and moved to a small cottage near Patricia in Portland. I published my book. I speak at conferences about elder financial abuse. I've helped establish a foundation in Michael's name that provides education and resources to families dealing with financial manipulation and domestic violence. Richard died in prison last year. Heart attack at 69 years old. I didn't attend any memorial service. I felt nothing when I heard the news. No satisfaction, no grief, just emptiness where my feelings for him used to be. Vanessa is still in prison. Her daughter is 5 years old now, being raised by Vanessa's parents. I've never met the child and probably never will. She carries no blame for her parents' crimes, but she's also not my grandchild. My only grandchildren would have come from Michael, and they'll never exist now. The knowledge I've gained through this nightmare, the education I've received in the cruelest possible classroom, these are the gifts I try to share. Every speech I give, every interview I do, every survivor I speak with, I offer them the lessons Michael's death taught me. That love cannot be bought or manipulated. That family bonds can be broken by greed, but also strengthened by truth. That justice, while imperfect, still matters. That speaking up even when it's terrifying is better than silent complicity. These lessons, this knowledge, this education, they're all I have left to give. Now, I want to ask you, dear viewers, what do you think of this story? How does it resonate with your own life experiences? Have you ever missed warning signs in your own family? Have you ever had to make the difficult choice between keeping peace and speaking truth? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your perspectives from deep in your hearts matter to me. Your stories, your lessons, your knowledge, they all contribute to our collective education about these important issues. If this story has moved you, if the lessons and knowledge shared here have value, please subscribe to the Voices of Auntie Rose channel. Click that subscribe button, hit the like button, and share this video with others who might benefit from Michael's story. Every day, we bring you compelling stories that educate, inspire, and remind us of our shared humanity. What lessons will you take from this story into your own life? What knowledge will you carry forward? How will this education change the way you see your own relationships? I want to hear from you. Comment below and let's learn from each other. To everyone watching this video, I wish you good health, happiness in your daily life, and peace in your hearts. May you have the wisdom to recognize danger, the courage to speak truth, and the knowledge to protect those you love. Remember, knowledge is power, education is protection, and the lessons we learn from tragedy can prevent future pain. Thank you for listening to Michael's story. Thank you for being part of this community where we share knowledge, offer education, and learn life's most important lessons together. Take care of yourselves and each other. Until we meet again in the next video, this is Auntie Rose, signing off. Goodbye, dear friends, and remember, subscribe, like, and share so we can continue bringing you these important stories every single day.